Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Coach Micah here. In our last video, we analyzed a negative case that I wrote and going into it line by line and showing you the direction that the negative was going. If you haven't seen it yet, then go ahead and click right here. But if you have seen it, then you'll know that the case is just half the battle, because in a negative speech, at least the first one in the round, you present a case, but you also need to refute the affirmative, and that is what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be essentially simulating a negative constructive / rebuttal speech. And my hope for the rest of the series is to continue down that simulation. We'll do the affirmative responses next, and we'll keep it going as I show you how the different responses would play out. If you want to keep tabs on this, I actually have an Excel file on my Patreon page. It's technically Google Sheets. You can go to my Patreon and you can actively see as it's being updated in real time, at least when it's being updated when I am putting responses on there. You may not edit it, but you can certainly leave comments on that Patreon post, and maybe those are arguments I will take into consideration. You can also talk to each other there and figure out the different responses. Maybe you thought one that I presented didn't work, or you really liked it and you want to tell me why. So go ahead and check it out there. The link will be in the description below. But today we are going to actively be going over the responses to the affirmative case. So let's jump right into it. This is the negative rebuttal. You may be wondering, Coach Micah, why is there a picture of Thanos? Well, watch this.
I told you. You'd die for that. You should have gone for the head. What did you do? What did you do? Where'd he go? For? Where'd he go?
Steve?
Now, what did this video exactly mean? Well, just like how Thanos had his famous snap, which caused basically half the world to just disappear, the goal of the negative rebuttal is to do the exact same thing to the affirmative case. With a good setup in cross-examination, which is a topic for another video, and the right refutation as well as the organization that we talked about in a video prior, we are going to completely dismantle and disintegrate the affirmative case. Now, this is our agenda for today. We're going to be responding to these arguments, and I've put them in bold, as you can see, of the ones that are going to mainly affect us today. Of course, we have a few definitions that we need to address and everything else, right? From their resolutional analysis to their weighing mechanism and, of course, their grounds and support. So let's get straight into it. first thing we need to do is respond to the affirmative definitions. When it comes to the negative case and the axis approach, we always start at the top with the definitions. Now, we can go into rhetoric. As I said, we had an intro in the negative case, and this is purely going to be a strategic and theory-based video. We're not going to focus on the rhetoric as much. So just pretend that there was an introduction that the negative gave, maybe about 15 seconds, 10 seconds. So now we start with the first definition, right? So the definition is of foreign policy that they've provided, a government strategy in dealing with other nations. And we can agree to this because our case as the negative doesn't really have a specific definition of foreign policy in mind. So we can just completely agree to this. Now, the affirmative had a definition of diplomacy, and they defined it as the established method of influencing the decisions and behavior of foreign governments and peoples through dialogue, negotiation, and other measures short of war or violence. Now, let me know in the comments before I continue of what you might respond to this definition as, but let's go ahead and take a look at it here. Our first refutation point is going to be of no distinction. And what do I mean by this? Well, they talk about how diplomacy is other measures short of war or violence. But that would mean that because military intervention does not equate war and violence, it could then therefore be a form of diplomacy under the opponent's definition, which doesn't work as a definition because it includes both diplomacy and military intervention. There's no real way to actually see a choice between the two. So therefore, we need to come up with a new definition. And this new definition, like we talked about, is from the Museum of American Diplomacy. I'm not going to read it right here. But this is the idea. Your opponent brings up a definition and you disagree with it, you refute it and give a good reason why. You then replace it with a new definition, and of course you have your reason to prefer. It's a link, right? Why should this make sense? Why should this definition be used? Why should we need a new one? Well, it's actually because it's the best for the debate. If we're trying to make a choice, a comparison, I should say, between diplomacy and military intervention in terms of their effectiveness, then we actively need to have them be separate entities. There can't be a gray area. There can't be a way to say, well, they're both effective. At least, maybe there could be, but that would be a balanced neg, right? The affirmative has to say that diplomacy is more effective. So by including military intervention as it's basically a form of diplomacy, doesn't really work out. Let's move on to the next definition here. We have the definition of military intervention, and it's just the deliberate act of a nation or group of nations introducing its military forces into an existing controversy. We can agree to this. It's not a problematic definition for us, and that's what we're going to do. Remember, you want to try to agree with as much as possible because that makes everyone's job so much easier as the round continues. With that, let's go to the next definition. So there should be a definition of effectiveness. And when I wrote the affirmative case, it sounded like, well, the way we measure effectiveness is actually with the resolutional analysis. And that's great, but anytime the affirmative does not define a term, even if it's because they think it's obvious why, you need to have a definition ready. You're going to provide a definition here, like we talked about in the negative video, a definition of what effectiveness means. And this is something that we can pull back to, or to reference when and if we need it in the round here. By having a definition ready, you are inserting yourself into the round in a way that is advantageous to you. So make sure you always have the definitions ready for each turn. All right. With that, we go down to the analysis if the case is organized correctly. Now, if your opponent is going all out of order, then we can talk about different ways to course correct this, but you essentially, again, want to go from the top down. You want to try to address everything at the top down. That'll help everything be organized. We'll talk about ways to organize this and to really fix messed up rounds in a future video. But for now, we're moving on as if this was a perfectly organized round to the analysis point. So they brought up the resolutional analysis of majority claim, which we touched on. And our response to this is going to be conflict necessary. So what they're saying is, well, we have to be looking at what is more effective in the majority of the time, like something that we can tangibly see a majority. But the problem, and this is where the negative poses the problem, is that conflict is not popular. It's not something that happens all the time and in the majority of instances. Actually, when foreign policy and military intervention meet, it's in very rare occasions. So rather than looking at the majority of the time, we actually need to look at specifically when there is conflict. And of course, this is what goes into our resolutional analysis. Now, a lot of people, what they do is they say, my opponent brought up the resolutional analysis of majority claim. You can tag my response to this as my own resolutional analysis. Don't do that. Rather, respond to the resolutional analysis with its own tag and then use that as the segue into your resolutional analysis. There should basically be two tags. My response to my opponent's resolutional analysis of majority claim, you can write down as conflict necessary. Blah, 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 blah. This leads me into the resolutional analysis that I'm providing, which you can write down as conflict necessary. They should have it twice on there. All right. Now the Wang mechanism. Okay, now we have the value of stability. The purpose of foreign policy is what they say. But we need to refute it. We need to talk about how we cannot guarantee the value of stability, because you can try and prioritize methods that seem like they lead to stability, but this isn't guaranteed. We need a value that has a higher chance of being upheld, if not a given. If you want to see the cross-examination questions that I would ask in order to give us the position to respond in this way, check out my Patreon page and the post there, one of the most recent posts. We're basically saying you can't guarantee that stability will be upheld. The affirmative cannot guarantee their value will be upheld, so we need a new value, and that's where we bring in our value of human dignity. And of course, we finish this off by giving the reason to prefer this value, which is the foundation of a moral government. Moral governments care about the worth and dignity of their people, and they treat them as such. All right. So this is where we would, once we have discussed the Wang mechanism, you're going to give your own grounds and support. You're going to have your contention, your subpoints. In this case, we have contention 1 and 3 subpoints, and then you're going to give your contention 2. And once you have done that, we can move on to your opponent's grounds and support, right? So they first brought up their contention of diplomacy stabilizes, and they had the application of ping pong diplomacy. Our first response is going to be tense relationship. China is not an ally of the United States. Even if we trade with them, relations are still tense, and some of us would consider them enemies. So the idea here is that our diplomatic relations between China have created this stable world. That's what the affirmative is saying. We did not have stability with China, and now we do. But the problem with that is that we don't. China and the United States are very tense. There was an basically kind of like an economic war that happened a few years ago. We're very tense with them. Relations are not good. We are not allies in any way. So how does this exactly show an example of stability, right? So that's our first response. But our second response actually helps us as defenders of military intervention, because in this negative case, we're arguing that military intervention is more effective. We say that, well, our second response is that militaries prevented war. The reason the Cold War stayed cold was not because of diplomacy. Every country involved was willing to deploy their military and arms at any point. And this is where we talk about mutually assured destruction, which is the threat of action is not sole diplomacy. It may be a negotiation tactic, but without military intervention, things would be different. So here we are introducing a concept of a gray area. Judge, my opponent thinks that diplomacy is what saved us from World War II because technically no militaries really intervened anywhere. But the threat of military intervention, the willingness to use military intervention, that cannot be, the credit for that cannot be solely given to diplomacy. So if anything, diplomacy and military intervention both had a hand to play equally, and therefore cannot be more effective than the other. This would be an example of a balanced argument, but that's what we would respond. And so our impact here, which directly responds to their impact of diplomacy stabilizes everything, or whatever it was, we say the impact is not stable. Diplomacy does not stabilize, because remember, the whole thesis of our negative case is to say that diplomacy by itself does nothing. You have to have military intervention at least, and at most, that is exactly what you're doing, intervening militarily. All right. So then we have the second contention: military intervention creates instability. And here they talk about the Vietnam War, which I think is a persuasive argument on affirmative, because basically what that means is a lot of people died for nothing. It was poorly run. We just wanted to get into war. We didn't even try diplomacy, or at least the affirmative thinks they didn't, right? So we have our first response, right? Before I defend the strategy of military intervention, I want to point out that the alternative could not have been diplomacy. The point of the intervention was to stop the spread of communism, something diplomacy couldn't do. They're still communists today. So we're getting rid of the notion that diplomacy might have worked. It just wouldn't. You don't fight communism with negotiation. Again, cross-examination questions that could put us here. So then we end with our second point of refutation, our second response: military intervention still effective. So this calls into the evidence the affirmative gave in their own speech. And I like to reference the evidence the affirmative gives. I like to take over my opponent's evidence because there's always something in there that they're not sharing with the world. And this is why it's really important that you have the entire article with you when you quote something, because it's really unhelpful for you or your opponents to just include maybe the paragraph that you quoted something from, but nothing else, right? That doesn't really improve the spirit of the debate. It doesn't really help. So make sure you are well read on a lot of these situations, because chances are your opponent is not going to be so gracious and is not going to have evidence with them. They're just going to only have the thing that supports their claim, which can be a response of its own. You can attack that point. But let's just pretend they did. According to the evidence that they read, we said, quote, according to the evidence, the military intervention was almost copy and paste from a different war. The problem was not military intervention. It was the fact they didn't adapt to the situation. The USSR fell partly due to USA military strategy. The Grenada invasion of 1983 is also considered a US victory over communism. Diplomacy could not possibly be an answer to communism, but different military strategies could be. So here I'm saying, listen, yeah, this military intervention sucked. It was horrible. It was bad. It didn't work. But that's because it wasn't made to work. They didn't actively put any thought into it. It was just copy and paste. Imagine if they did, because we have fought communism on other fronts in the world, and we did just fine. So military intervention was not the problem here. It was actually diplomacy. And so you'll notice I'm taking away the talking points the affirmative had in these applications, the insinuations, right? You need to understand what the big picture of these arguments are. They're insinuating things. There's a lot of nonverbal communication going on here. They're hinting at different arguments. With these applications, they're hinting that diplomacy would have been the answer. If we had diplomacy, it would have worked. We wouldn't have needed this terrible military intervention. And so what I'm doing is I'm looking big picture, and I'm addressing that. I'm talking about how diplomacy didn't work and that military intervention could still have been more effective. And that's going to take all the power away from the affirmative side. Once you're done, you should have plenty of time, maybe even 30 seconds to wrap up your speech. And that's just a rhetoric choice I like to use and that's why a negative ballot, that's why affirmative ballot is warranted. I think it sounds cool. But you can also say, and this is why you should vote negative, this is why you should vote affirmative, etc. And that is the negative rebuttal. In our next video, we're going to be addressing really the turning point of debate rounds when the affirmative starts having shorter speeches and therefore has a lot less time to adequately address every point the negative brought up. It's often what wins the round for the judge before the next two speeches are even given. So we're going to be talking about how to do that well as an affirmative. And of course, the negative may think that they have won this day, but rather the affirmative is going to come back and win. If you found this video helpful, I would appreciate some feedback. And also, I want to let you know that when I create these videos, they go straight onto my Patreon the night prior. I usually edit these videos and finish them up Sunday evening or by Sunday evening, and they go straight to Patreon. So if you're a night owl and you want to see these videos first before anyone else, go to my Patreon page. Otherwise, you'll just have to wait, about 10 hours until Monday morning at 9 a.m. Pacific time. And that is when I will see you next week, next Monday, as we address the affirmative case. So until then, see you later.